Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Secret Sunday Subscriber Scary Stories. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. Today's story is sent in by a doctor out in Pennsylvania. Let's get right to it. The story is called Dogman Stalked My Pregnant Wife. Dear Scary Stories. This story happened to me and my wife way back in the late 1970s. I was a general practitioner, or in other words, a family doctor. I had taken over the practice of someone who had worked that area for 25 years, and he used to make house calls. I still did as well for his older customers, but was phasing it out and transitioning to the more modern way of having people come to visit me at the office. Still, some of the people I cared for were in delicate situations, and I had considered getting a car phone so that I could be reached while in transit in case of an emergency. When my wife got pregnant, I now had even more reason to get one installed, so I did. If you're not old enough to remember car phones, they were kind of a hybrid between a landline and a cell phone with a little walkie-talkie thrown in for good measure. It could sometimes be hard to get a line out or a line in because they operated over the air through an antenna, and there were a limited number of channels available at any given moment. But still, it was the best thing available in those pre-cell phone days, and I was very glad to have it. Especially on the day I'm about to tell you about, when a dogman stalked my pregnant wife. So, on the day in question, I left my practice a little early to check in on an elderly patient and then head home. Once I was on the freeway, however, I received a call from my wife who sounded panicked. She was due in another 2.5 weeks, so I grew immediately concerned when I heard the tone of her voice. She told me there was a monster outside the house trying to get in, and I immediately thought that the stress had gotten to her and that she had lost it. I calmed her as best as I could, and she told me there was a dog-headed bear monster running around the house and occasionally throwing itself into doors to try to get in. I asked her if she had phoned the police. She said she had, but they didn't sound as though they believed her, and she didn't expect them to come. I didn't blame the police since I wasn't sure I believed her myself. I tried to calm her, then told her I had to call my patient and cancel our appointment, but that I would call her back as soon as I was done with that. As I had said before, one couldn't always rely on being able to get a line out on that old car phone, and after I was done with my patient, I was unable to reach my wife again for some time. I tried again and again, every minute or two, but was having no success. When the phone rang and it was my wife, I at first was relieved. The relief didn't last very long, though, as she sounded more agitated than before. She was crying and making little sense. I found it hard to make out what her words were in between the sobbing and the gasping. Then she started screaming incoherently, and I drove the car faster, pushing it to the edge of the speed limit. I knew that area was heavily guarded by cops with radar, so if I went over the limit, I would get pulled over to the side of the road, and I did not have time for that. I tried to calm my wife and remind her that she was very, very pregnant, and that panicking was not good for her or the baby, but she kept screaming at the top of her lungs, and I couldn't understand a word she was saying. Up to this point, I was convinced all of this was taking place inside her stressed out mind. It never occurred to me that there might be something real trying to actually break into the house. We had lived in that house almost a year by that point, and nothing strange at all had ever happened. Then I heard something that changed my mind. First, I heard a window's glass being smashed. It's an unmistakable sound, even when transmitted over the radio waves on one of those old car phones. Then, of course, I heard my wife scream in reaction. It dawned on me that someone actually was trying to break into our home, and that my wife, literally, was in danger for her life. But what I heard next truly terrified me. There was an angry, snarling, barking sound that followed, soon mixed with my wife's screaming and crying. That was not a person trying to break in. It was an animal. I asked her again to tell me what the thing looked like. I heard words here and there, but there were major dropouts and she was crying heavily. Basically, I got werewolf and bear and dog and caveman. That was not a very nice picture she was painting. My mind could not piece one picture together from all that information. What looks like a caveman, dog, bear, and werewolf at the same time? I became afraid that it might be an oversized dog with rabies or something along those lines. An idea crossed my mind that hadn't before. I should tell my wife where I keep my gun. And so I did. I told her to go to the bedroom and open the third drawer from the top in the drawers next to my side of the bed. She ran to the bedroom and did what I asked. Then I told her to take the case out from in there, and I explained how to use my combination to open it. When she had, she shouted in horror that there was a gun inside. I tried to calm her, saying she should use the gun if the dog got in the house. But it turns out she was far more afraid of guns than I had ever known. Seeing it only got her more upset than before. She began shrieking at me that I had no right to keep a gun in our house without telling her, and then suddenly she started shouting in a far different way. Her water broke. The situation had induced pregnancy over 2 weeks before it was due to happen. She began immediately going into painful contractions. That baby was going to come far sooner than expected. I was still 10 minutes from home. I needed to get there and get her to a hospital, since I was still closer than an ambulance would have been, even if I hung up and called one right away. I told her to go to the front door and wait for me. She screamed that the werewolf would get her if she went there. In frustration, I shouted that was what the gun was for, and then we lost our connection. I tried once to get a line back to her, but when that failed, I just focused on driving home and gunned the engine to get back there. As I pulled up in front of the house, I heard gunfire coming from there and the sound of a wounded dog whimpering and squealing. I jumped out of the car and ran full bore toward my home, and as I did so, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There was a man running away from the house, away from me, running down my driveway and toward the woods behind. It was the tallest man I had ever seen, but it had to be a man because it had long legs and it ran bipedally. It seemed to be dressed in a black jumpsuit from head to toe. Before entering the woods, that man turned and looked back in the direction of the house for just a second. And I swear to you, that thing had the head of a wolf. It wasn't wearing a dark jumpsuit. It was covered in dark fur. It really was a werewolf type creature, exactly as my wife had told me. She wasn't seeing things because of the stress. She was seeing this thing because it was really there. My wife. That was why I had come here to get my wife to the hospital. My feet began moving again, but my mind was still in shock from what I had just witnessed. I rang the doorbell even as I got my keys out to unlock the front door. I wanted her to know it was me and not take a shot at the front door out of panic. She and I opened the door simultaneously, and she fell into my arms, clearly in great pain. I carried her into the car, and we drove. She said almost nothing the entire trip, but I could tell when her contractions came, and I was timing them roughly using the clock on the dashboard. It was a close call, but we got her to the hospital and got her admitted, and then the baby came out minutes later. My son, Jason. He came out sickly, and he had to stay in the hospital for 3 days along with his mom before both were given a clean bill of health to go home. Except that house was no longer a home to us. My wife refused to go back there. I rented a small apartment for us closer to my practice and contacted a real estate firm to sell the house. About 8 months later, we were able to afford a new home in a somewhat more urban setting than our last one. For the rest of her days, my wife never wanted to see Forest ever again. She would be nervous even around small patches of trees. Jason grew up into a healthy boy, and now a healthy man with a family of his own. We told him part of the story of how he was born too soon, always joking with him that he's ahead of his time in all ways. But we never told him, and I still to this day haven't told him, that the reason he came out early is because Dogman stalked my pregnant wife. Hope you liked that. We'll be back tomorrow night with our Monday night monster show. And then Tuesday, there's a special event in New York if you're near the area. Here's a little message about that right now.
OMG! Come on down to my hood this Tuesday night, the 25th, where the new AI character created by Will Brierly is gonna interview this guy who got married in a Taco Bell. This smiling lady from Canada. The hip-hop gamer. Hooray! One night only at the improved asylum, yo. 26th Street off 8, inside the back of the Soupy Market. You can't miss it.
Very, very time.
Come back for more scary stories.